Hello, everybody. My name is Patrick, and this is my list of my 12 favorite albums of 2017. This is part 2 of a 3-part series, so if you haven't seen part 1, go back and watch it. That was where I talked about my 12th, 11th, 10th, and 9th favorite albums of 2017. In this video, however, we're going to be talking about albums 8, 7, 6, and 5. So let's start off with number 8. Album number 8 on my list is Dark Matter by the band The Rasmus. They're a very cool band from Finland who started out as a ska band back in 1996, actually, when all the four members were still in high school. And they ended up sort of over time morphing and changing their sound into more of a Gothic rock sound and actually adding a bit of metal in there every now and then. They haven't released an album for quite a while, and their previous album was a lot more electronic, but at the same time, sort of stripped down from their previous albums. This album is a lot different. Like I said, it's their first album in quite a while, and it actually sounds a little bit more like their singer solo album that came out, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. There's a few hints of guitars and real drums on this album, but for the most part, it is dance beats and sort of hip-hop beats. The album has a very much flow to it that is really nice and easy to listen to, but the songs do start to feel pretty repetitive. They still keep the sort of gothic nature in the songs, but the songs have more of like sort of a dancey approach. So again, I know I've said it multiple times, but it's so different from them. The more I listened to it, the more I found myself enjoying it. All the songs are structured almost identical, so it can get a little bit repetitive after a while, but I think each song has a bit of a different hook to it, which makes it enjoyable to listen to throughout. The last song on the album is a cool sort of ballad type of song called Dragons into Dreams, which is a neat song. The artwork's really cool, though that probably doesn't really matter to you, but I'm a sucker for cool artwork. Let me look at that in there. So definitely still keeping the sort of gothic vibe. But anyway, a cool band to check out if you've never heard them before and you're into sort of rock music, but not necessarily super heavy rock music. This album is very feel-good and at the same time still with the dark vibes. So that's my number 8, The Rasmus. Number 7 on my list, what I do consider to be my favorite band, The Birthday Massacre with their album Under Your Spell. I love this band. As I mentioned, they are my absolute favorite, and I consider them that because they are such a unique band. They have such a unique and interesting sound. They manage to mix sort of fantasy-sounding bells and 80s synths and things like that. Very sort of nightmarish landscape, but at the same time fantasy-like, dream-like, with heavy rock bordering on metal music. Very simple guitar riffs, but chuggy, heavy riffs, and a lot of 80s influence in there as well. And so this album, the reason it's high enough on my list to still be considered, I would consider it a great album. Obviously, if it's on my list this year, it's a great album. But lower than I would want it to be is that I feel like they're getting a bit stale as a band. I have all of their albums, and their sound doesn't really change very much from album to album. I actually preferred their album 2 albums ago to this one, and this is their second album that was crowdfunded, and I feel it like it sounds and feels very much like their previous album. All that being said, I do feel like they tried as hard as they could to sort of call back to their earlier albums on this record, and that does give it a bit of an edge up in terms of their overall catalog for me. There's only 10 songs on the album, and I would like it if it was a little bit longer, so that's a bit of a negative thing, and that's kind of something I felt with their last album as well, very short albums recently. But with this album, it's heavy enough that I would consider it one of their heaviest albums, but it still feels and sounds basically like their several previous albums. And so that's what I mean when I say it's stale. There isn't really any specific song on this album that stands out as me as being like a great Birthday Massacre song. It's just basically another Birthday Massacre album. That being said, I do like it a lot, but this is a band that I sort of am starting to look at their catalog as a whole in my mind. It's hard to separate what comes from what album, with the exception of, in my opinion, their best album, which is Walking with Strangers, which is their second full-length album. And if you want to look into them, I would recommend that album over this one. I feel like at this point, the Birthday Massacre's albums are really only being made for people who are already fans of theirs. But if you are a fan, this is just more of the same. I like their music enough that it definitely needs to be on my list. And this album is higher than their previous one, which was pretty low on my list 2 years ago when their last album came out. But still, I would say a bit of a disappointment to me. And so you might be getting the sense here that with my top 12 list, a lot of the albums I've been talking about so far have been kind of disappointing to me. And I think that that's interesting to point out, that an album can be disappointing to me, but still has enough importance or is still enjoyable enough to listen to that I feel they deserve to be on my list. And that's a good way to talk about this album, because they are the Birthday Massacre. I have a bit of a bias when it comes to them because I love them so much. But if you've never heard them before, definitely check them out. It's hard to kind of describe their sound, but basically think sort of like sparkly bells and synths and things like that, like xylophone sounding glockenspiel type stuff with a sort of a darkness over the top of it, and then a heavy sounding guitar to put over the top of it, and all female vocals. So check them out if that sounds interesting. That is the Birthday Massacre. Album number 6 on my list. This is a really fun album, and something I found out on accident, actually, by listening to the daily briefing on my Alexa, Amazon Alexa, that I have at my desk at work. This is the album Southern Gothic by Tyminski, which Tyminski is short for Dan Tyminski, who you might know as being the vocalist, the male vocalist, and I believe acoustic guitar and banjo player in Alison Krauss and the Union Station. He is also very famously known for for being the voice of George Clooney's character in the musical parts of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? He sang the song Man of Constant Sorrow. So if you listen to this album, it might sound familiar to you for that reason. And very recently, over the last few years, he did a song with an electronic artist called Avicii. And I can't think of the name of the song right now, but it was a huge hit song. And doing that kind of put the idea in his head that maybe he could make an electronic album too. So that's what this album is. It's called Southern Gothic, and I feel like that is a good name for it because it sort of implies the sort of southern, bluesy, southern culture vibe that's infused in every song on this album. But at the end of the day, it's electronic pop song, sort of in the vein of Imagine Dragons or One Republic or something like that. It still has a bit of a darkness to it and a sort of a religious vibe to it. I would definitely say this is categorized or could be categorized as being a Christian album. I know a lot of people don't like Christian music, but maybe don't let that scare you from this, because I feel like it's definitely good enough that you should pay attention to it and give it a listen. There's not a lot of acoustic instrumentation on this album, which is one thing that I wish they would have included a little bit more. There's a few songs where Dan does end up playing banjo or acoustic guitar on, but there's very few songs that are actually driven by acoustic instruments. For the most part, it is just, I feel like the song was written on acoustic guitar, and then they recorded it, and then they basically just took the acoustic guitar out of the song, if that gives you a bit of an idea of how the songs sound. But very cool, very fun album, good vibes all the way through. There's 2 songs on it that I really like, one called Haunted Heart and the other called Devil is Downtown, and those are the songs that are the sort of the most acoustic-based, creepy, southern, gothic-y vibe that I was kind of wishing the whole album would be. But again, I don't want to sound negative on this album. There's very negative things I have to say about it. The production is very crisp and clear, and I would have liked to have been a bit more of a dirty, sort of bluesy style of production. The character of these mixes, the mixes don't have very much character, so it doesn't sound anything like the Alabama Shakes or the Black Keys or the Heavy or something like that. It does sound much more crisp and clear, like Imagine Dragons or AWOL Nation or something along those lines. So that is Dan Tyminski with Southern Gothic. And so number 5 on my list, and we're getting into some really great stuff here. This is the album One More Light by Linkin Park. And this is a tough album to talk about because Chester Bennington's passing earlier this year, it really hit me harder than any celebrity death has ever hit me. And it's interesting to think why. You know, I've been a fan of Linkin Park since the beginning. I remember the first time I heard One Step Closer, it was at a professional wrestling live WCW event. Bought their album and have loved all of their albums since then. And I'm the type of Linkin Park fan that kind of likes their music that everybody else dislikes. I love their album A Thousand Suns a lot. And most people consider that to be one of their worst albums. But that album is a very electronic album. There's almost no guitars on the whole album. And that is what this album is. This album is a straight-up electronic album, similar to the Dan Tyminski album, actually in style. It is very much like One Republic, AWOL Nation, Imagine Dragons style stuff. Electronic music, big beats, big synth, walls of synths, and very little guitar. And I just think that this album has incredibly well-written songs on it. I think that this is definitely one of the best Linkin Park albums in my opinion. And I don't just say that because I was very sad and emotionally connected to this album when Chester Bennington passed. And if you are a Linkin Park fan and you know Chester at all, you know how hard life was for him and how much he struggled with depression and everything. And you can hear that all over this album. And listening to this album, knowing that, it can't help but affect your opinion of the album. But even if you take all of that away and you just look at this album in terms of the songwriting, the sounds, I don't, in previous albums, I don't really care for when Mike Shinoda sings at all, but even on this album, I didn't mind it. I really enjoyed every song on this album for different reasons. The rap parts that are on this album feel really cool. Linkin Park doesn't do rap very often anymore, and I think there's only 2 songs on this album that really have anything that I would consider to be rap. Both of them are great songs. There's a sort of acoustic-y, almost sounding song at the very end called... I believe it's called, Sharp Edges, and it's a great song. One of Linkin Park's best, in my opinion. My favorite song on the album, though, is called Battle Symphony, and it's one of my favorite songs of the year. They used a lot of pitch-shifted vocals on this album, which is a new thing for them, and normally I don't care for that, but with this album, it really did work. Everything that they did on this album really worked. Their big single, Heavy, featured the guest female vocalist, and it was a very pop-sounding song, and it just worked. It worked, and people were mad when it came out and saying that this isn't Linkin Park, it's not rock music. Well, Linkin Park hasn't really ever been one thing. But anyway, I don't want to argue about Linkin Park. All I'll say is that this album and the Dan Tyminski album specifically, my top 6 albums this year were so good, and especially the top 3, and I'll get into those in the next video. But the top 6 albums this year were just so good. It really was a joy to get all of these albums this year, and the Linkin Park album was a surprise to me. I haven't been enjoying their previous 2 or 3 albums as much as their earlier work, and then up until A Thousand Suns. And this album was a surprise, and every time I put it in and listen to it, it feels fresh, and it feels like I like it more and more every time I listen to it. So that is my number 5 favorite album of this year, One More Light by Linkin Park. And so there you have the middle of my list. I'm really excited for the next video to talk about my 4 through 1, specifically 1 through 3. Because while I think my albums this year, 1 through 6, were all great, 1 through 3 are just phenomenal. And I actually think that my top 3 favorite albums from this year will end up being in my top 3 favorite albums of all time. All 3 of them, and I really do think that. But that's next video. So for this video, I'm going to say goodbye, but I want to remind you that in the comments, please let me know if you discovered a band from this. And in the description of this video, I'm going to end up putting down there a link to a song from each of the albums, so that if something sounded interesting, you can go ahead and check it out. And then I'm also going to put a link in there to the first part, which if you haven't watched, you should go do, and the next part, which will end this series. So hopefully 2018 is as good as 2017 was, and thank you for watching.